A man who survived the Vietnam War through a downpour of bombs and a storm of bullets returned home missing a leg. Day after day, he drowned himself in drink. At one point, he even tried to take his own life, driven by a fury and hatred toward God. On a night of driving rain, a tiny, soaking boy stood in front of the drunken soldier, looked him squarely in the eye, and said a single sentence that upended the man's whole worldview. That line snapped him awake, changed his faith, and altered the rest of his life. That sentence changed everything, and it will make you ask, can miracles really occur in the midst of the deepest sorrow? Let us listen to a true story. Darkness. After coming home, the darkness that followed the war did more than blink at the sky. It crept into the very core of his soul, like a hungry beast that would not stop gnawing. On a cold autumn night, wind howled through the cracks of the old house, slipping in like invisible fingers that swept every corner and carried the smell of damp earth and rot. In the small room on the outskirts, a man hobbled inside. His wooden crutch clicked and clacked on the floor, each sharp sound striking the heavy silence. He was an American veteran returned from the battlefields of Vietnam, a survivor who was no longer whole. His remaining leg trembled as it bore his thin frame, but what weighed on him most wasn't the broken body. It was the haunted memories of comrades who had fallen, their blood mixing with the tropical rain and staining the ground red. Wounds that could never be washed clean from his mind. Streetlight from outside slashed through the window, slicing the darkness and lighting his gaunt face, his hollowed eyes dulled by exhaustion and bitterness. In his hand was his service medal, a bright scrap of metal that had once been a source of pride and the stuff of lifelong dreams. Now it felt like a cruel joke. He clenched it, then, with a sudden motion, hurled it into the corner. The metal hit the floor with a harsh clang that echoed in the room, cold and empty as fate's derisive laugh, like the barefooted footsteps of the fallen circling back into the room. He looked up at the crucifix hanging on the wall. Pale yellow light fell across his face, outlining his trembling lips and clenched hands. Half delirious from fatigue, he almost imagined God standing there, silently watching him. But instead of peace, a surge of rage rose up, choking him. His voice came out hoarse, a guttural roar from a wounded animal. If God exists, why did he let me come back like this? The room sank into a silence so complete he could hear his own heart hammering, each beat like a blow to his chest. Anger flared like a wildfire, burning the last scraps of faith he still had. He collapsed into his chair, hands shaking as he buried his face. Darkness washed over him and swallowed his soul. In that moment, everything felt meaningless, every light extinguished. From that pitch-black void, a dark journey was just beginning. Lost soul. After returning home, his life drifted like a boat with a broken oar, helplessly adrift on a sea of blood-soaked memories. Time crawled by like a rusty clock hand. Each day was filled only with bitter liquor and the tattered pieces of the past. By daylight, he shuffled along the gray streets, a limping figure that looked more like a ghost than a man. The wooden crutch tapped the pavement in a steady, funeral drumbeat that carried across the damp, lonely air. He avoided the eyes of passers-by, curious glances, pitying looks, even frightened ones. Every step ripped open wartime memories, bombs that shook the sky, gunfire that cracked like thunder, the guttural screams of comrades as they fell into smoke and flame. At night, when darkness swallowed the room, he plunged into nightmares with no escape. The roar of artillery thundered in his head, helicopters sliced the night like a tearing wind, and desperate cries rose like a deathly orchestra. He would bolt upright, drenched in sweat as if he'd been plunged into cold water, his heart pounding as though it would burst from his chest. In that despair, he would clutch a bottle and gulp it down like a man dying of thirst in a desert. The burn of the liquor seared his throat, but it dulled his mind. A temporary curtain pulled over the pain. Outside, a fine, dusty rain fell under the pallid streetlights. Elongated, distorted shadows of him shimmered on the pavement, wavering, tremulous, as if his soul itself were adrift, abandoned on the thin border between life and death. Each breath came heavy, like a funeral toll for the life he once had. Yet, in that impenetrable night, something was quietly approaching, an unexpected event, as if an invisible hand reached out to pull him back from the self-destructive whirlpool he was sinking into. The fruit-selling boy one misty morning, a chance encounter seemed to drop an unexpected seed onto the barren soil of the soldier's soul. The country road lay silent, a thin veil of fog still hanging across his vision. Dew clung to the branches like tiny tears of dawn, catching the faint first light of day. The soldier paused, his wooden crutch striking the wet, mottled ground with a dry, hollow sound, the opening beat of a sorrowful song. By the roadside, a frail boy in faded, hand-me-down clothes had set out a small basket of fruit. The scent of fresh fruit mingled with the damp smell of earth, weaving through the chill morning air, making the scene feel both alive and mournful. The boy looked up at him, eyes caught between curiosity and caution. His gaze settled on the chain of dog tags hanging from the man's chest, cold metal slivers, each stamped with a name, like tiny gravestones dangling against his body. The boy's voice broke the silence, soft but sharp enough to pierce the air. "Are you carrying the names of those who died?" The soldier froze. His hand clenched into a fist so tightly that his knuckles went white. His jaw locked, breath caught in his throat before it tore loose as a hoarse, clipped reply, "Comrades." Just 2 syllables, yet they sliced through the quiet like a blade. His eyes darkened, and it felt as though the shadow inside him spilled outward, smothering what little sunlight had begun to rise. The boy fell silent, gripping the handles of his basket as though holding onto a secret. In his heart, a seed had just been planted, a seed of a question, of a curiosity with no answer yet. The soldier bent down, picked up an apple from the basket, and turned it over in his hand. The cool skin pressed against his palm pulled him back to another memory, when he was still a young man, biting into a ripe red apple just before marching off to war. The image flickered and dissolved, leaving only a bitter taste at the back of his throat. He placed the apple back into the basket and walked away, his shoulders trembling as if he carried an invisible cemetery upon them. And with each heavy step, he could not have known that this meeting would become the thread tying him to a truth deeper than even his own pain. A family's secret, that brief exchange had not only left a scar on the soldier's heart, but also cracked open a door into another family's past. That very afternoon, he returned to the same road, and the boy was still there. The air was sharp with cold. Wind hissed through the rows of trees, making the boy's thin shirt shiver with each gust. Clutching his basket of fruit, his voice trembled like a dry leaf about to fall. "My mother keeps something too. She says it belonged to my father, and that he will come back. But now I understand, it's the keepsake of someone who died in the war." The soldier's head jerked up. In the boy's eyes burned a pain far too old for his age, like tiny sparks flaring against the dark. His voice was slow, but each word struck the man's chest like a hammer. "My father isn't coming back. Mother hid the truth from me, so I could still have hope. She told me, God still watches over our family." The wind rustled the trees. From afar, the church bells tolled, each note echoing like a call from another world. The sound pressed against the soldier's heart, the same heart where faith had once burned brightly, only for him to smother it himself in a night of rage. Now, from the words of a fatherless child, another flame was kindling, small, unsteady, but stubbornly alive. His chest tightened, as though his heart had been shaken awake after being buried in dust for too long. The soldier turned away without another word, his steps heavy and slow. In his mind, the bells kept ringing, their echoes blending with the boy's voice into a mournful yet strangely warm melody. Faith, the thing he thought he had lost forever, seemed to be finding its way back, not as a blazing fire as it once was, but as a fragile glimmer slipping through the cracks of darkness. And then, the very next morning, an unexpected turn of fate pulled the invisible thread between the soldier and the boy taut, stretched to breaking, the warning of a storm about to break. The fateful storm that night, the sky itself seemed to rage, unleashing rain in torrents, pounding down as if to wash the world away. Each drop was like an icy blade striking bare skin, lashing rooftops, sweeping fallen leaves, dust, and the damp breath of loneliness into its flood. The soldier staggered forward, the sharp reek of liquor still clinging to his breath, the burn of whiskey like invisible chains dragging him down into the freezing mud by the roadside. He collapsed, palms sinking into the murky puddle, dirty water splashing across his hollowed face. He no longer wanted to rise. His body felt leaden, his eyes blurred by the storm. It was the same sensation as that moment long ago when he fell in battle, when the world dissolved into chaos, leaving only the hammering of his heart and the stench of blood. His voice cracked through the storm, hoarse and raw, a muffled roar against the pounding rain and thunder. Let me stay here, the way it was back then on the battlefield. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled after it, booming like the cannons of memory fired from another life. Each crash struck his chest, a reminder of the comrades who had fallen, the faces now gone, the names he still carried on his chest like a curse. It was as though they whispered to him in the storm, voices filled with both reproach and longing. He closed his eyes, letting the rain sting his skin, surrendering himself to the undertow of memory and despair. The scene was at once brutal and strangely still. Wind howled, rain drummed on tin roofs, thunder roared, as though the heavens themselves were weeping for a lost soul. In that moment, he felt smaller than a grain of sand in a storm, a capsized boat swept away in a flood, stripped of any will to fight back. And yet, in that very storm, fate was preparing to send a hand, small enough to slip into his own, but strong enough to pull him back from the edge of the abyss. The small hand in the middle of the storm, a sound broke through, sharp as a blade cutting through the heavy curtain of despair that smothered the soldier. Footsteps splashed in the puddles, then a young voice rang out, clear and unflinching against the growl of thunder. I just wish my dad could have come home, even if it meant losing a leg like you. But he never did. The soldier's eyes snapped open. Through the white curtain of rain, he saw the outline of a boy, soaked to the bone, clothes plastered with mud. His wet hair clung to his forehead, his eyes red with grief, but blazing with something fiercer, an almost defiant resolve. The boy stepped closer, knelt down beside him, and stretched out a small trembling hand. Steady despite its shake, you have to stand up. Your brothers who fell, they did it so you could live. The words split through the fog in his mind like a strike of lightning. Memories of the battlefield surged back, a flood he could no longer dam. Gunfire cracking like whips, the acrid bite of smoke, helicopter blades thundering above, comrades hurling themselves into the storm of bullets to shield him. He saw again their eyes, terrified yet blazing, as if entrusting him with their last hope. The image crushed his chest, as if a fist had gripped his heart. Tears broke loose, spilling down his cheeks to mingle with the rain. A sob tore from his throat, raw and unrestrained, shattering the silence he had locked inside for years. His cries bled into the storm, into the thunder, like a lament finally released to the heavens. And in that flood of grief, a truth rose up. Hope had never abandoned him. It had only lain dormant, waiting to be awakened by a child's small, outstretched hand. Slowly, the soldier pushed himself upright, leaning on his crutch. The boy's hand remained clutched in his, channeling a strange warmth that coaxed his heart back into rhythm. Their shadows stretched long across the rain-slicked road, one large, one small, merging with the night yet flickering alive in the lightning's flash. That fateful storm was ending. In its wake, a dawn stirred inside the soldier's soul, where darkness began to retreat, yielding ground to a fragile but growing light. And in that moment, he knew he could never collapse again. A new battle awaited, one against his past, against his guilt, and against the man he once allowed himself to become. The child's testimony, the rain kept pounding, drumming against the old tin roof like a funeral march for both past and present. Under the church eaves, the soldier sat hunched, clothes clinging to his body, water dripping steadily from his hair, each drop falling like time itself into a bottomless pit. He sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the boy across from him, whose small hands clutched a basket of fruit so tightly it trembled, as though he were holding on to the last scraps of his life. The boy's voice broke through the heavy downpour, fragile, quivering, yet sharp enough to cut through the storm. "I'm an orphan because of the war. I'm still alive because of God. But there are hundreds of others like me, some born crippled, some sick for life, because of the poison left behind." The soldier froze. His chest seized as if an unseen hand had wrapped around his heart. Images once blurred came rushing back into focus. Children's dirt-streaked faces, eyes wide and innocent yet carrying unbearable sorrow, twisted limbs, frail bodies racked by silent cries. Sounds from the past pressed in a ghostly symphony, the chop of helicopter blades tearing the sky, the thunder of bombs, the screams of comrades bleeding out. And then, out of the depths of memory, came the voice of a fallen friend, echoing like a whisper from a grave deep in the jungle. "If you're the one still standing, then live for us." His heart flinched, the old wound split open anew. Each word from the boy cut like a small blade, slicing through the hardened armor of bitterness, prying open a door he had bolted shut for years. The rain blended with his ragged breaths, the boy's fragile whisper threading through it, together weaving a mournful chorus, not to drown him, but to wash him clean. The child's testimony was no longer just his own story. It was the voice of an entire generation abandoned by war. It was a reminder that the soldier carried not only his own pain, but also the weight of lives never given the chance to grow. And in that moment, he understood his survival, though limping and scarred, was still a gift, a fragile cord tying the past to the present. He closed his eyes and felt his heart tremble, like a small church bell tolling into the stormy night. And in its ringing, something stirred, a quiet strength, a whisper reminding him that perhaps it was time to rise, not only for himself, but for the souls still waiting. The wound unhealed, the storm had eased, leaving only a thin drizzle, silver threads falling over the empty street. The scent of damp earth clung to the air, heavy in every breath. The soldier knelt beneath the church eaves, fists clamped so tightly around the tags of his fallen brothers that his knuckles turned white. The wind whistled through the rusted roof, a voice from the past carried on its howl. His own voice broke the silence, raw and jagged, each word torn from the deepest hollow of his chest. Where was God when the bombs rained down? When bodies piled into mountains? When half of me was left behind on that field? The boy still stood there, small against the vast darkness, yet his eyes did not waver. His lips trembled, but his voice rang steady, echoing across the damp stone porch. God was in the ones who shielded you, and He is in you because you are still alive. The words struck him like an arrow, piercing through the armor he had welded around his heart for years. He staggered inwardly, the force of memory crashing over him, gunfire cracking like thunder, the blinding flash of exploding shells, comrades falling across his body to shield him, their eyes ablaze with a last flicker of hope. Rain soaked his shoulders, icy and relentless, yet it felt as though it was washing away the dust and ashes of bitterness that had settled in his soul. His breath quickened, pounding like a war drum, but now it carried a different rhythm, the pulse of life returning. And suddenly, he understood. The wounds in his heart were never meant to bury him, but to remind him of why he was still here. Each raindrop with a whisper of forgiveness, each gust of wind, an urging to rise again. In that moment, the soldier was no longer a man lost in shadow. He was a witness to sacrifice, a living vessel of memory, entrusted with keeping the fire alive. The rain kept falling, but no longer as a funeral dirge. It had become a cleansing him, soothing the wound still open, preparing him for what lay ahead, the chapter of choice, of decisions that would shape the rest of his days. He had crossed the boundary of darkness, reclaimed the meaning of survival, and learned again how to open his heart to love. His journey was not merely a return to the church, but a return to himself, to the humanity buried under the wreckage of war. From that moment on, he knew survival was not for hiding, but for carrying the weight of memory, for finishing what the fallen no longer could. Returned to the house of God a few days after the storm that had nearly undone him, the soldier limped slowly down a narrow street strewn with fallen leaves. Each strike of his cane against the cobblestones echoed, "Thok, thok," like a drumbeat guiding him back to the place he had avoided for so many years, the old church, weathered but still standing in silence at the heart of the town. The wooden door creaked open, releasing a breath of incense and aged timber, a fragrance that seemed to whisper stories long kept within these walls. Dim light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the floor with shifting patches of crimson, emerald, and gold, like fragments of a sacred tapestry cast upon the earth. He felt his knees, shoulders trembling, eyes brimming until tears spilled freely. His voice, hoarse and broken, rose nonetheless with the clarity of a small bell. "Grant me one life worth living." The prayer dissolved into the hush of the sanctuary, but within his chest, a tide was rising. The clock on the far wall ticked in steady measure, mingling with the sigh of the wind slipping through the cracks, together forming a solemn requiem for the past and a quiet procession into something new. Each toll of the church bell outside seemed to pulse like a new heartbeat, summoning back a long-lost hunger, the desire to live with purpose, to seek redemption, to give of himself. In that moment, he saw survival not as a stain, but as a calling, as a gift bound with responsibility. And there, in the scarred soil of his heart, hardened by years of war, a small seed of hope stirred, fragile, trembling yet alive, taking root among the ashes of memory. The reluctant father from the day he stepped back into the church, the soldier found a new rhythm to his days. He began helping care for the orphans, children with wide, unclouded eyes who looked at him as though he were a steady landmark in their unsteady world. Each morning, the scent of hot porridge rose from an old pot and drifted through the room, blending with the soft ripple of laughter, creating a melody of warmth he had thought long forgotten. He learned to cook, his hands at first trembling, then growing steadier, as though each turn of the ladle was stirring his own life back into motion. The scars on his body became living lessons. He showed the children how to bandage a wound, how to help each other rise after a fall, how to stand guard for one another, just as his comrades had once shielded him on the battlefield. One evening, as the last light of the sun filtered through the window, a small hand clutched at his. A trembling voice whispered, "Father." The words sliced gently through the wall of ice around his heart. He bent down, gathering the child into his arms, feeling its warmth seep through his body. In that moment, he knew he had truly been given a second chance, not only to live as a man, but to live as a father. Each smile, each soft call of "Dad" became threads stitching together the deepest wound in his soul, reminding him that a meaningful life was not about reclaiming the past, but about giving away whatever remained of the present. The church bells tolled in the distance once again, this time not as stern reminders, but as notes of encouragement. He rose to his feet, his step lighter, ready to walk forward, toward the children waiting for him, toward a chapter yet unwritten. The soldier was no longer a man crushed by the weight of memory, but a torchbearer who rekindled hope for an entire community. From one who had fallen in the shadows, he had become a guide, turning pain into strength and survival into a promise made on behalf of those who had never returned from the field of war. The call that morning, the weak sunlight pierced through dew-soaked branches, falling in fragile golden streaks across the wooden platform where the soldier stood. He leaned on his cane, his body thin, but his eyes blazing like twin embers. The crowd held its breath, only the rustle of leaves remained, like nature's own choir waiting for his first word. His voice rose, hoarse but unshakable, each word striking like a drumbeat against the hearts before him. Though I have lost a leg, my heart still beats to love. 58,000 American soldiers never came home. That means 58,000 families live with an empty chair at their table. Let us build a fund for their children, the orphans left behind. For a moment, silence hung heavy, as if the earth itself paused. Then suddenly, applause broke like a summer storm, rolling over rooftops, rushing through the streets, sweeping away the dust of long years of sorrow. Faces that moments ago were strangers now lit up, glowing like sparks in a frozen night. They weren't just listening to a speech, they were watching a man rise from the ruins, handing them proof that pain can be turned into purpose. In that moment, the fire in his chest no longer burned as the fire of war, but as a guiding flame. Each word he spoke was like a seed, dropped gently into human hearts, taking root in the rhythm of breath and pulse of an entire community. The soldiers stood there, one leg gone, but taller than ever as a pillar of spirit where weary souls could lean and find strength. And as the applause thundered on, he knew a door had just opened, not only for himself, but for every child, every grieving family still yearning for hope. A lesson written in blood and tears that afternoon, sunlight poured through the window, gilding the worn lines of his face, which now shone with unshakable resolve. Standing on the wooden platform, he faced a silent crowd, every eye fixed on him as if to catch even the rhythm of his breathing. He drew in a long breath, then spoke low, measured, but sharp as a blade slicing through the air. 58,000 American soldiers killed. More than 2 million Vietnamese lives lost. I survived, which means I must live for them, for my friends, and even for my enemies. The hall grew so still that the wind slipping through the rafters could be heard. Memories surged, bombs tearing the sky apart, the acrid stench of gunpowder, comrades collapsing in his arms. Blood and tears mingled with the rain, each drop etched forever into his heart. He lifted his gaze toward the window, where the sunset burned crimson across the horizon. That light seemed to whisper, "From mud and blood, the seeds of compassion can still take root." His voice was no longer just a story. It was a warning, a charge. Survival is not an excuse for indifference, but a call to turn memory into kindness, pain into a force that can save. In that moment, the entire hall seemed to breathe as one. The crowd's heartbeat aligned with his as they felt both the sacredness of life and the heavy burden of what it truly means to be human. A profound ending, the evening settled gently. Sunset spilled gold across the room, brushing the faces of the children gathered around him. Their laughter rose like a flock of birds, mingling with the rustle of leaves outside, a lullaby that soothed the ache of a lifetime. He sat in an old wooden chair, his cane resting at his side. His eyes followed every step, every burst of laughter, drinking in the life that now filled the room. His voice, warm and steady like a bedtime hymn, carried stories of the battlefield, of brothers who never came home, of years lost in darkness, and of the long road back to faith. The children listened in silence, wide-eyed, as though storing each word, each image, deep in their hearts. Then the church bell tolled through the stained glass window, its echo falling over them like a blessing. He smiled, placed a hand over his chest, felt the strong beat of life within, and whispered, "I lost a leg, but God gave me a family." In that moment, every scar, every long night of grief, every cry that had once haunted him seemed to dissolve, leaving only the light that wrapped itself around him and the children. The scene carried a truth etched deep. No matter how brutal the war, no matter how heavy the loss, a human being can rise again, finding love and the freedom of a life lived with meaning.